The sun was setting on the small town of Wermelskirchen, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets that stretched between simple houses, each one a testament to the peace that had lasted for decades. Yet beneath the tranquil exterior, something darker was stirring, whispers of war, of an empire's ambition, of a world poised to collapse under the weight of its own making. The air was thick with anticipation, but for Hans Müller, life seemed still, quiet, and far from the horrors that loomed on the horizon. Hans had always been proud of his uniform. The sharp cut of the woolen coat, the gleam of his polished boots, and most importantly, the bright white insignia of the Wehrmacht on his shoulder. It symbolized his commitment, his duty to the fatherland, to his country. At 22, Hans was young, eager, and full of the kind of idealism that only someone untouched by the brutality of war could possess. He had joined the army in the early days of his youth, swept away by the fervor of the rising regime, believing that the future was one of prosperity and honor. Yet, as he stood at attention, listening to the drill sergeant's orders, something gnawed at the back of his mind. It wasn't fear, it wasn't even doubt. It was a sense of unease, a feeling that something was amiss in the world around him. The town, which he had always considered peaceful and safe, had begun to shift in its own way. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones, and even the local priest, Father Albrecht, whose sermons had once been a source of comfort, had become a figure of silent resistance. In his letters, Hans's older brother, Wilhelm, who had been sent to the Eastern Front months earlier, wrote of the harsh conditions of war, of frostbitten fingers, of hunger, of friends lost without names. Hans had written back, proud and determined, that he would soon be joining him on the front lines. After all, that was where the real work was happening, wasn't it? Where the fatherland would be forged into a new empire. The following morning, Hans woke to the sound of marching boots, the crisp command of the officer in charge, and the whir of the transport trucks. His unit was being moved to the outskirts of Cologne, where they would prepare for their next mission. He dressed quickly, sliding into his uniform with the practiced ease of someone who had worn it almost every day since joining the military. As he strapped his belt and adjusted his collar, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. His face was set in a stern expression, his eyes cold and focused. He had grown since he first donned the uniform, matured in ways he hadn't expected. There was a hardness to him now, a resolve that came not from knowledge, but from blind belief in what he had been told. The truck ride to Cologne was uneventful, but as they neared the military barracks, a heavy silence fell over the men. They could feel it in the air, the gravity of the moment, the weight of what was to come. The war was not some abstract idea anymore. It was real, and it was here. Hans could see it in the eyes of the older soldiers, men who had seen the horrors of battle and lived to tell the tale, or perhaps to forget it. They didn't speak much on the way there, but Hans could feel the tension rising with every mile. The orders they would receive soon would change everything. Upon arrival, Hans and his comrades were marched to their barracks, where they were assigned their quarters. The walls were bare, the air thick with the smell of freshly washed wool and old leather. He was to share a small room with a soldier named Karl, a man from the Black Forest region, whose thick accent made it hard for Hans to understand him at first. But Karl's eyes were kind, and his presence was a comfort. He was a few years older than Hans, but there was something about his calm demeanor that reassured the young soldier. Karl had been through a lot, he had said, and he had survived. That alone made him worthy of respect. As night fell, the barracks grew quiet. Hans lay on his cot, staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The noise of the other soldiers settled into a murmur, but his mind was racing. He thought of his family back home, of his parents and sister, of the town he had left behind. Would he ever return? Would he see them again? The questions weighed heavily on him, but he quickly pushed them aside. He was a soldier now. His duty was clear, and the war would soon come to him, whether he was ready or not. The next morning, after a simple breakfast of stale bread and cold coffee, they received their orders. Hans and his unit were being sent to the front lines of Poland. The war was officially upon them, and there was no turning back. The world they had known, the world of peace and quiet, was slipping away. As the trucks rumbled out of the barracks and toward the unknown, Hans's mind wandered back to the days before the war. He remembered playing with his friends in the fields, the laughter of his sister as they ran through the tall grass, the calm evenings spent by the fire. But those days were gone now. The world was changing, and Hans was changing with it. The journey to Poland took several days, and as they crossed into enemy territory, Hans could see the first signs of devastation. The once beautiful countryside had been scarred by bombings, the villages reduced to rubble. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. War was not glorious. It was not a cause to be proud of. It was destruction, pure and simple. And yet, as they prepared for their first battle, as the sound of artillery fire echoed in the distance, Hans found himself ready. There was no turning back now. The Iron Cross on his chest gleamed in the morning light, a symbol of his duty and his loyalty. He was a soldier. He was ready to fight. But as the trucks rolled forward, the doubts remained. The image of his family, his home, and the life he had once known haunted him. Would he ever be the same again? Would anyone be? The war had begun, and Hans Müller was about to discover just how far the world, and he, could be pushed. The days on the Eastern Front were colder than anything Hans had ever experienced. The bitter winds cut through his uniform like 1,000 tiny blades, and the snow seemed to stretch on forever. It was not the war he had imagined. The fields were not heroic battlefields, but vast, desolate stretches of frozen earth where every step felt like a battle against the elements themselves. The men around him were hardened by the hardships of the front, their faces gaunt from the cold and the lack of food. The camaraderie that had once been a comforting presence seemed strained now, as every day became a test of endurance. Hans had arrived with his unit in the early days of the winter offensive, and the freezing temperatures were not the only challenge they faced. The Soviet forces were relentless, their soldiers appearing from the forests like ghosts, seemingly endless in number. At first, Hans believed the war would be like the stories he had heard, moments of great valor, heroic charges, and decisive victories. But in the bleakness of the Eastern Front, there was no room for heroism. There was only survival. Hans had been assigned to a machine gun unit, a position that required both precision and patience. The hours spent manning the gun were endless, the only sound the whistling wind and the distant crackle of enemy fire. When he wasn't on watch, he huddled in the cramped, icy trenches, wrapped in a woolen blanket, trying to get some rest. But sleep was elusive. The constant fear of a sudden attack or an artillery strike kept his senses sharp, but it also wore him down. Every morning, when the orders came to move out, it felt like a small victory to have made it through another night. The first battle Hans participated in was nothing like he had imagined. It was not a glorious charge across open fields but a brutal, grinding struggle to hold a series of trenches. The Soviet forces were relentless, their artillery pounding the ground around them as Hans and his comrades dug in deeper. The cold was unbearable, and the exhaustion began to take its toll. He could see it in the eyes of the men around him. Something was breaking. The once unshakable belief in their cause was slowly slipping away, replaced by the stark realization of the war's true cost. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when Hans wondered if it was worth it. The constant deaths, the screams of his comrades as they were torn apart by shrapnel or machine gun fire, it was overwhelming. One of his closest friends, Eric, had been standing beside him during the first wave of fire. Eric had been an optimistic soul, always quick with a joke and a smile. But that day, as the bullets flew past them, Eric was hit. Hans had heard him cry out in pain, and before he could turn to help, Eric was gone, his body a mangled mess on the battlefield. The loss shook Hans to his core. He had seen death before, but this was different. This was personal. After the battle, Hans found himself questioning everything. Was it worth the sacrifice? What were they fighting for? The ideals of a greater Germany seemed hollow now, as the reality of war consumed him. The men in his unit spoke little of the cause. Instead, they spoke of survival, of getting through each day, of staying alive long enough to see the war end, whatever the outcome. But even that hope seemed fleeting, as the Soviet forces pushed them back, inch by brutal inch. The constant retreat was soul-crushing. They had been told that victory was within reach, that their reinforcements would arrive, that the Soviet forces would soon collapse. But with each passing day, the truth became clearer. The German army was not invincible. They were tired, hungry, and outnumbered. And yet still they fought. Hans's thoughts often turned to home. He thought of his family, of the small town he had left behind, and the life he had once known. Would he ever return? Would the war ever end? Each day seemed to stretch longer than the last, and with each passing moment, the world outside the trenches seemed farther and farther away. He had heard stories of soldiers on the Eastern Front who had given up, who had deserted or thrown themselves into battle with reckless abandon. Hans had never considered surrendering to the enemy, but there were moments when he longed for escape, for an end to the madness, the endless suffering. The more Hans saw of the war, the more disillusioned he became. The Soviet soldiers, despite their relentless assault, were just men, fighting for their survival just as he was. They, too, had families, homes, and dreams, all sacrificed for a cause they had no control over. It was the realization that everyone was trapped in this war, soldiers on both sides of the conflict, that shook Hans the most. The futility of it all. The futility of war itself. The next major battle they faced was another test of endurance, one that would break many of the men in Hans's unit. The weather had turned even colder, and the trenches were flooded with snow and ice. They had no time to dig deeper or reinforce their positions. Their rations were dwindling, and the supplies they had been promised never arrived. They fought on, but the lines were thin, and the enemy was closing in. Hans's unit was ordered to make one last stand, an attempt to hold their ground against the overwhelming Soviet offensive. But this time, there was no hope. No heroism. Just a cold, silent struggle to survive. As the Soviet tanks rolled through their defenses, Hans found himself face to face with a soldier from the opposing side. They locked eyes for a brief moment, two men who had been thrust into a war they never asked for, fighting for causes they no longer understood. The enemy soldier raised his weapon, but something in Hans's eyes must have stopped him. For a fleeting second, they both hesitated. And in that moment, the world seemed to pause. But the war had no time for hesitation. The soldier fired, and Hans's world went black. He awoke in a field hospital days later, his body battered, his mind clouded by the concussion and fever. He had survived, but for what? The war was not over, and he was not the same man who had entered it. The weight of the past weeks, the battles, the losses, the endless cold, hung heavy on him. His ideals, his belief in the cause, were gone. All that remained was the desire to make it through another day, another battle, in a war that seemed to have no end. The days that followed were a blur of cold, exhaustion, and chaos. The battles on the Eastern Front raged on, each one more grueling than the last. Hans's unit had been driven back once again, retreating to a more defensible position after a fierce engagement that left half of their men dead or wounded. The Soviet forces were relentless, pushing harder with every passing day. Hans had seen enough bloodshed to last a lifetime, but it was as though the war itself refused to relent. For the first time, he truly began to feel the weight of the war pressing on his shoulders. Each day blurred into the next, and the boundaries between day and night seemed to disappear. The snow was relentless, and the biting wind was a constant companion. Hans's feet were numb in his boots, his fingers stiff and aching from the cold, but still, he fought on. There was no escape, no reprieve from the constant violence. He had lost so many friends already, comrades who had once shared his dreams of victory. Now they were little more than memories, faces in the fog of war. It was a cruel irony, but Hans was beginning to understand it. The only thing that mattered now was survival. The days of glorious battles and heroic victories seemed like a distant memory. Now, it was all about getting through each moment. Hans could no longer recognize the man he had once been. The idealism that had filled him when he first donned the uniform had long since evaporated, replaced by a cold, pragmatic desire to stay alive. The war had broken him in ways he hadn't expected, stripping away everything that had once been certain. Every day, he wondered if he would still be alive the next. Every battle seemed like it could be the last. It was in this environment, amidst the crumbling remnants of his comrades' spirits, that Hans began to question the very nature of the war. It wasn't just the brutality, or the endless killing that disturbed him, it was the pointlessness of it all. He had joined the army with the belief that he was fighting for a noble cause, that his country's future was at stake. But now, as he gazed out over the frozen battlefield, he saw no greater purpose. The men around him were nothing more than pawns in a war that seemed to have no end, no victory. The brutality of the conflict made him question everything. He could no longer deny the truth: this war was not about honor. It was about survival, and nothing more. Hans had never truly believed in the propaganda that had been fed to him all these years. He had believed in duty, in protecting his family, in the idea of a better future for his country. But now, standing on the front lines of a war that seemed endless, he couldn't help but wonder if all of it had been a lie. There was no glory in war, no honor in killing. There was only pain, loss, and a constant battle against the cold, the hunger, and the fear of death. Hans knew that deep down, he had always known this. But now, it was impossible to ignore. As the days wore on, the tension in Hans's unit began to rise. The retreat had left them vulnerable, exposed. They were surrounded on all sides, and the prospect of reinforcement seemed increasingly unlikely. The men grew more restless, and the whispers of discontent began to spread. The once united group of soldiers had fractured, each man lost in his own thoughts, each one struggling to hold on to his own sense of purpose. Hans was no different. He had been a soldier for nearly 3 years now, and the weight of it all was becoming unbearable. He was physically exhausted, mentally drained, and emotionally numb. The hunger pangs that gnawed at him were nothing compared to the hunger for meaning, for something to believe in. But that hunger, too, seemed pointless. What was the point of fighting anymore? What was the point of any of this? It was during one of these long, restless nights that Hans finally cracked. He lay in the mud, staring up at the sky, his thoughts a jumble of fear, doubt, and despair. The stars above seemed distant, unreachable, as though they, too, had abandoned him. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of artillery fire, the shriek of incoming shells. It was the sound of death, of destruction, and it was all around him. He had been in countless battles, but this one felt different. There was no hope left, no reason to keep fighting. The enemy was relentless, the terrain unforgiving, and his comrades, those few who remained, were barely hanging on. It was then that he made his decision. He would desert. He could no longer fight for a cause that had lost its meaning. He couldn't continue to watch his friends die, to suffer alongside men who no longer cared about the war, about the cause, or about anything except survival. He would leave. He would run. And if he survived, he would make his way home. He wasn't sure what awaited him there, but it had to be better than this. The decision was difficult, but in that moment, it seemed like the only option left. Hans knew that desertion meant death, that he would likely be executed if caught. But the alternative, the endless cycle of war, seemed far worse. He had seen enough death, enough suffering, to last a lifetime. He couldn't endure any more. So, in the dead of night, Hans crept away from the camp, his footsteps muffled by the deep snow. He didn't look back. The journey was brutal. With every step, Hans could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him. He had no plan, no real direction. He simply knew that he had to leave, that he had to get away from the front. The cold was unbearable, and the constant fear of being discovered made every sound seem like an alarm. He didn't know how far he would make it, but he was determined to survive. Days passed, and Hans stumbled through the wilderness, each moment a battle against hunger, exhaustion, and the ever-present fear of being caught. The harsh landscape, once so familiar to him, now felt alien, as if the world itself was conspiring to swallow him whole. But he kept going. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stop. He had chosen life, and he would fight for it, no matter what it cost. In the end, Hans's escape was both a victory and a defeat. He had left the war behind, but the war had left its mark on him. He would never be the same. And as he made his way toward an uncertain future, he realized that there was no true victory in war. Only survival. And even that came at a cost. The weeks following his escape from the front were a blur of uncertainty and pain. Hans had managed to find his way back into the relative safety of the rear lines, but there was no safety for a deserter. Every step he took felt as though he were being hunted, though the enemy was not just on the battlefield. The real threat was within his own ranks. To desert in the middle of a war was a crime punishable by death, and Hans knew that if anyone discovered what he had done, he would never see another sunrise. He had no choice but to lie low. He found shelter in a small village tucked away from the main roads, hoping that the chaos of the war would conceal him long enough for him to disappear. The villagers, weary from years of occupation and constant conflict, barely took notice of him. They were more concerned with their own survival, their homes scarred by bombings, their families struggling to make ends meet. Hans, looking haggard and exhausted, blended in among the weary civilians, doing what he could to help without drawing attention to himself. He worked odd jobs, carrying firewood, repairing fences, and delivering food, anything to avoid suspicion. His German uniform, now stained with dirt and threadbare, was a constant reminder of the life he had abandoned. He knew he couldn't stay in one place for too long, but for the first time in what felt like years, Hans could breathe. The air was different here, free from the clamor of artillery and gunfire. He had a brief taste of peace, and it was more precious to him than anything. Yet, the war continued to gnaw at him. Hans couldn't escape the weight of his actions. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of his fallen comrades, the men he had once fought beside, men who would never have the chance to see the life he now had the privilege to live. He remembered Eric, his closest friend, lying lifeless in the snow. He had promised himself that he would survive this war, but the guilt of abandoning the fight lingered in his soul, a constant reminder that his escape came at the cost of his comrades' lives. It wasn't long before the reality of his situation caught up with him. One evening, as Hans returned to the village after a long day of work, he was stopped by a patrol of soldiers. They were from his own unit, part of the same division he had deserted. Hans's heart raced, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. He stood still, praying they wouldn't recognize him. They were exhausted, much like the rest of the soldiers in the war, but still, they were sharp-eyed, trained to spot deserters. Hans kept his head low, his heart pounding in his chest as the soldiers questioned him. His name was called out, and he froze. For a brief moment, the universe seemed to tilt, the weight of his fear pressing him down. They recognized him. Hans quickly gathered himself, and gave the name of a long-forgotten relative who lived nearby, hoping that the soldiers would accept his explanation and move on. To his surprise, they did. They grunted their acknowledgement and let him go, unaware of the real reason for his sudden appearance in the village. Hans let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It was close, far too close, but for the moment, he was safe. Yet, the feeling of safety was fleeting. He knew this was only temporary. The thought of being caught was like a shadow that never left him. He couldn't stay in the village forever, and he couldn't return to the front lines. His body ached from the physical toll of his desertion, and his mind felt just as weary. He needed to find a way out. By now, the war had taken an even darker turn. News had reached the village that the Allies were advancing, and the German forces were in retreat. It was clear that the days of victory were gone, and the reality of defeat was beginning to set in. Hans watched from the edges of the village as the German army withdrew, their retreating soldiers disorganized, demoralized. There was no sense of unity, no sense of pride in the retreat. The war was ending, and with it, the ideals that had driven him to join in the first place. He had joined to defend his country, to fight for what he believed was right, but now, all he could see was the collapse of everything he had once known. The ideals had crumbled, and all that remained was the ruins of a shattered world. It was in this moment, that Hans made the hardest decision of his life. He could no longer stand by and watch his country burn. He could no longer be a part of a war that had no meaning. But what was he supposed to do? He could not go home. His family would never accept him after what he had done. He couldn't return to the front. He couldn't continue living in this state of constant fear. The decision was simple in theory, but terrifying in practice. Hans knew that the only way he could atone for what he had done was to join the resistance. He had heard whispers of underground movements, groups of soldiers and civilians who had begun fighting against the regime, trying to stop the madness. It was dangerous, but Hans felt it was the only path left to him. He couldn't undo the past, but perhaps he could help build a future. A future where people like him didn't have to endure the horrors of war. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The resistance was scattered, their numbers small, their operations dangerous. But it was a chance, and for the first time in a long time, Hans felt like he had a purpose again. He found a group of resistance fighters hidden in the forests, men and women who had risked everything to fight against the atrocities of the regime. They welcomed him into their fold, their eyes wary but understanding. It wasn't about loyalty to a country anymore. It was about doing what was right. Joining the resistance wasn't a return to the past. It wasn't about fighting for an empire or for a cause that had long since lost its meaning. It was about making a stand, no matter how small, against the tide of destruction. It was about fighting for the future, not for the past. For Hans, it was a chance to redeem himself, to make a difference in a world that seemed beyond saving. The resistance was more than just a movement, it was a fight for survival. Each day was a battle, each step a challenge. But Hans felt the weight lifting from his shoulders, little by little. He wasn't sure if the war would end in victory or defeat, but at least now he could look himself in the mirror without the gnawing guilt of his past decisions. As he fought alongside the resistance, Hans came to understand one thing above all else: war may end, battles may be lost or won, but the true fight was the fight for humanity. It was the fight for a future where people didn't have to choose between loyalty to a regime and loyalty to their own conscience. For the first time since the war began, Hans felt that he was on the right side of history.